everyone for being here. I especially want to thank the Career Center for organizing this, as well as Hoyas for Health, which has been keen in putting together a lot of the healthcare chats we've been seeing all around the country. I want to give a quick plug to the Hoya Gateway website, which is possible. It's a resource website for all Hoyas. Please check it out. And second, please join our Hoyas in Health LinkedIn group, which now has over 900 members. I see Sahil and Tessia on here as well, and Steph, who are keen in organizing this. I don't know if either of the three of you want to add something about the group, but it's been wonderful to watch the quick growth as a fellow Hoya. Anybody want to add something about it?
Sure, I can say a quick few words. So my name is Sahil. I'm the committee chair for Hoyas in Health. Hoyas in Health is an incubating alliance, which is basically a group that's coming together, or a group of alumni from different sectors of healthcare, working on the common mission of improving care across the continuum. What separates Hoyas in Health from, I think, other sort of alumni groups is that we're an umbrella organization. So we have everyone from providers to entrepreneurs to financiers. And again, the whole goal is cross collaboration. And we've had a number of great happy hours up and down the Eastern Seaboard, a couple of career panels, as well as some panels focused on more niche parts of healthcare like finance. So highly encourage everyone to join our LinkedIn group. We're a fast growing community and look forward to everyone's participation.
Great. Thanks, Sahil. My name is Martyna Skowron. I'm the NHS class of 2009. I'm very excited today to talk about zigzag careers, as well as welcome our fellow panelists. I'll be moderating this conversation, and I am the epitome of a zigzag career. I started in NHS as a human science major, thinking I was going to be a physician. Always was pretty, I would call, actually obsessed with hospitals and their structure and the healthcare system. As I moved here at 13 from Poland and was an uninsured immigrant, but broke my arm. So I had a very personal experience getting bumped around the system. And from that point on, I started volunteering in a hospital. My grandmother and my mom started working in a hospital, and they still do. So we have 3 generations in hospital administration. After Georgetown, I did an administrative fellowship at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, and went to the Harvard School of Public Health, where I studied healthcare policy and management. Spent my first year at the School of Public Health, second year at Harvard Business School. And it was right during the ACA. So when I graduated, I implemented the ACA across the nation as a management consultant. Then joined as director of surgery and owned all of surgical services at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and experienced the first burst of technology in healthcare. What it meant to implement an electronic medical record, and quite frankly, it was a disaster for everybody involved, despite the massive planning and the amount of dollars and timing and everything. So I went to the Mecca of technology in San Francisco. To find better technology that served humans. Started in a late stage startup there, Castlight Health. Understood what a product meant for the first time, which was unique to me coming from healthcare. Then was part of the founding team at Commure and built that company through the Series B. Now it's at 4.5 billion supposed valuation, but raised a $550 million round. Then went to Amazon Web Services and served as the worldwide principal of business development for venture and startups in healthcare. And now I'm at a very early stage startup that is building the first emotionally intelligent AI bot that also recognizes facial features and tone intonations. And we are deployed with the unhoused population through SCAN Health Plan in California, and we'll be applying it in mental health and women's health and cancer care. With that, I'd love to turn it over for a brief introduction to our amazing panelists that I'm thrilled to hear from today. Why don't we start off with Stephanie?
Boy, well, that was a very impressive overview. I have questions for you, but I will try to follow that. So hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Saki. I am currently the United States Coordinator for Global Health Security at the White House. And also the Deputy Senior Director at the National Security Council for Global Health Security and Biodefense, which is a mouthful, but I work a lot on global health security and global health more broadly. So I went to Georgetown undergrad. I graduated in 2002 from SFS, although I started in the college and transferred to SFS. I was really interested when I was in Georgetown undergrad in doing public health, but there were basically no public health classes at the time. So I had to be pretty creative. I wrote my senior thesis on some public health issues, but I know that that's changed a lot since I was there. When I left Georgetown, I couldn't find a job for 8 months. So I waitressed full time at Sequoia on the Georgetown waterfront, which still exists. I finally got a job at an NGO that doesn't exist anymore, but it was called the Academy for Educational Development. It was absorbed by FHI, so it's now FHI 360, but I worked there for 4 years. Then I went to the Harvard School of Public Health also to get my Master of Science degree in public health, so a 2-year degree. When I finished at Harvard, well, I will say that while I was there, I was certain that I would never get a PhD, and I only wanted to do applied public health work. I got a job at the National Institutes of Health at the Fogarty International Center out of Harvard, and applied for a PhD program that year, even though I had really insisted I was never going to get a PhD just a year before. So I was full-time at NIH for a year, and then I continued to work at NIH for another 4 years while I got my PhD at Johns Hopkins in public health with a focus in international health. When I finished my PhD, right before I finished, I got a job at the Population Council, which is sort of a think tank that also has a biomedical research facility based in New York. So I started working there, and then I started a new job, defended my PhD dissertation, and got married in a 2-week period. I worked at the Population Council for 8 years. And in the time I was there, I started out as sort of a junior researcher. And then by the time I left, I was leading a research center that we launched while I was there that was focused on adolescent health and well-being around the world, called the Girl Center. It's still there. I sort of on a whim decided to consider going into government in the middle or the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So I sent my CV to a couple of people, got a phone call. They asked me if I wanted to work at the Department of Health and Human Services in an office that I had never heard of. I agreed to do it. And so I started in the beginning of the Biden-Harris administration in March of 2021 in the Office of Global Affairs at the Department of Health and Human Services. I was there for 18 months and then was pulled over to the National Security Council at the White House to oversee the government's work in global health. So I did that for a year and then moved over to my current position in global health security and biodefense at the National Security Council. And then in February of this year, President Biden appointed me to this role as U.S. Coordinator for Global Health Security, which was created by Congress. So I am the first person in this role, which has pros and cons for sure. And that's where I am now.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's super impressive. I also have questions for you. So welcome. Sahil, why don't you go next?
Thanks. Yeah, so I have lots of questions for this esteemed panel. I have far less experience than everyone here, but I'll try to keep up. So my zigzagging kind of started right at Georgetown. I was admitted to the college, then 1 semester later, jumped over to the MSB, and then in my sophomore year, jumped over to what was then the NHS and now the School of Health. Ended up doing my major in healthcare management and policy and was trying to do the pre-med thing, but I met organic chemistry, and that was the end of that. After graduating from Georgetown, followed a lot of Hoyas up to Capitol Hill. Spent 2.5 years in the U.S. House of Representatives as a health policy advisor for Energy and Commerce Committee members, if that means anything to anyone. And then spent 2.5 years in the Senate on the Senate Caucus on International Narcotics Control, doing some health policy work there. After doing 5 years on the Hill, left to pursue my MBA at the Wharton School, which actually has a lot of Hoyas. So what did my MBA in healthcare management policy, graduated from that back in May of 2024. During my MBA experience, I had the opportunity to kind of pivot into the private sector, did some strategy and consulting work for Pfizer and their oncology team. Currently, I am not to be surprised, I'm currently doing my MPH at Harvard, another common theme on this panel, in quantitative methods, which is Harvard's fancy way of saying epidemiology and biostatistics. And currently also doing some independent consulting work for some biopharma folks here in Boston, and I'll be returning to Pfizer after graduation in May 2025.
Amazing. Thank you, Sahil. And nice to have a diverse perspective across all different like age ranges of Hoyas. So I guess we can zigzag at any level. Molly, why don't you go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Molly McCarthy. I am a 1994 graduate from the School of Nursing and Health Studies. Actually, I believe we called it GUNS, which was, very inappropriate. GU Nursing School. Now wouldn't fly, but I was also on the women's soccer team. So I'm a huge supporter of both men and women's soccer. I just can't wait to go to the game actually this coming week. But my background, I initially started thinking I wanted to be a French major and be a diplomat, and ended up as a nursing major, primarily because of a personal experience with my mom having cancer and watching her go through the health system. She passed away while I was in college, so that really spurred my interest in healthcare. And I ended up working at Georgetown and in the DC area in neonatal intensive care and pediatrics. So that was kind of a theme for the first 15 years of my career. However, I only worked clinically for about 2 years, and I moved to California and worked at Stanford, Lucile Salter Packard Children's Hospital. I don't know if it's still called that. Back in the day of pagers and fax machines before EMRs. And the surgeon that I worked with there actually was a Georgetown grad, and that's a huge piece of what I'm going to say today. It's, really networking with your fellow alums, et cetera, so important. I don't think I would have gotten that position with the pediatric kidney transplant team had I not gone to Georgetown. So fast forward, I went to business school out in California and really wanted to bring together my clinical background, as well as I was living in Silicon Valley. So the tech background that I was seeing, everyone in my business school was in some type of .com. And I was actually started to transition from a clinical role into product marketing in a company called Natus Medical, which was a startup at the time. And that was really, it produced devices in which the area I worked. So I was more of a clinical expert at that time. Fast forward, I moved back to the East Coast about 7 years later. And I joke, I said this the other day, but I went out with my Honda Civic and I came back with a husband, a big moving van, and a baby. So, but I was, what I think about in my career is I've really worked in tech for a long time when devices were standalone, to the point where I went to Philips, and I did a lot of work with NIH, quite frankly, and Walter Reed Military Center. At the time it was Navy, but started to watch the integration of the devices into EMRs, into the hospital networks, so that we're starting to really collect all the information and data on the patients. And I agree with whoever said before EMRs were a nightmare. I spent many hours in data closets back at NIH and the Naval Center. Anyway, in 2013, Microsoft contacted me. And that was really the advent of the cloud technology. And I went there. They were really trying to push their limits, I guess, in healthcare and other industries. And so I went there really working with them to demonstrate the conversation you want to have in a healthcare setting around technology. 10 years there, fabulous. And I've been out on my own for about 18 months doing health tech advising. I advise 3 different startups. One is pre-funding, one was just acquired, and then the other one is Series A. And I also have a podcast really looking at AI and ambient monitoring in technology. I've done 40 episodes, and my episode last week was with the dean at Georgetown. So take a listen. I did put a link in there too, so I'm just going to make a plug.
Great. Thanks, Molly. And I do have to add, you were part of the inaugural team, the soccer team at Georgetown. So
Yes, that's how old I am.
no, it's wonderful. It's wonderful to see how far women's soccer has come.
Yeah, I mean, they occasionally allowed us to play on the field, the grass field, as long as we didn't mess it up for the boys.
Oh, goodness. All right. Well, I'm glad we can all play on the same field now. And last but not least, Bo, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Bo Bigelow. I graduated from the college in '96, and I studied French and Italian and philosophy, so not really the healthcare curriculum so much. From Georgetown, I went to law school after that, and then I practiced as a trial attorney in New York City for about 10 years. And I was doing consumer protection work. And in about 2010, that's when my zigzag began. Our daughter Tess was born with a genetic disorder that causes autism, and it was causing her to be nonverbal, and she wasn't walking, and she needed supervision pretty much 24/7. And her disease was so rare that it didn't have a name at the time, and she was the 8th patient who was diagnosed in the world, the 8th. So the zigzag was basically me walking away from that law career. I am back in law right now, just part-time. I do disability rights law here in Maine where we live. But my big job now is I run this foundation that my wife and I created, a nonprofit to try to cure this disease. We have really 2 goals with our foundation. The first is to find some more patients. So Tess was patient 8, and now we're over 250 in the world. And our other goal is to fund research. And so we've been doing a lot of work to try to make those 2 things happen. I also create a good amount of content myself, just to make Tess and the other patients seen and known. That's really important, especially when they're nonverbal and can't speak for themselves. And really, a lot of my work that I do with the foundation is I'm building a team of scientists. I'm recruiting these minds, people who study this gene that's mutated in Tess, and I'm trying to read their work and understand it, and then recruit them and bring them along for the ride with us, have them join our tribe. So it's great to be here. Thank you.
Oh, that's quite a story. And as I mentioned to you before, we have another Hoya who's studying a sort of medications that have alternative uses. So David Feigenbaum is also a pretty respected Hoya, and I was lucky to be in school with him at the same time. So we'll start off with the first question. And again, please feel free to add questions in the chat. I'd love to hear, or just introduce yourself. We'd love to see who's joined and who's part of our conversation today. But the first question is, and Molly, just so you know, I'll start off with you, but then I'll take volunteers afterwards. At what point did you realize your career needed to take a different direction, and how did you navigate that direction?
That's a very good question. And that's something I'm still working on today, quite frankly. I think, if I look at my career, the pivots in the first part of my career were really based upon curiosity and interest in doing something bigger for healthcare, and taking risks, I think. So I think, when I worked clinically as a nurse, I felt like I was making a very big impact in individuals' lives, but I really wanted to think about how I could, quite frankly, help revolutionize health, which we still are working on, and in a bigger way. And I had always been interested in technology. So I think one of the big pivots in my career was moving from clinical into a medical device company. But it seemed very natural because I was really using a lot of what I did as a nurse, as a product manager, interfacing with the engineers, sales, marketing, et cetera. And really was kind of an advocate for that product. And I think too, another point at which I have pivoted is, quite frankly, leaving full-time work and kind of going out on my own, to do something different and have an impact based upon my experience over the past 30 years, which I, was kind of uncomfortable doing, but I felt like it was the right thing to do based upon, quite frankly, I felt like Groundhog Day in some of my work, and it was time for me to kind of pass the torch to the next generation.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Honestly, I just came from HLTH. It's really wonderful to see a lot more nurses, especially Georgetown nurses in the tech space. So really thrilled you made the pivot, and we have some nursing expertise outside of physician expertise or administrative expertise. Anybody else want to answer this question?
I mean, maybe I'll just add that I agree with the way that Molly is describing it. I think approaching it less as, what is the job that you want to do for your career, and more as what are the issues that you feel passionate about and driven by. And those kind of can evolve and expand in different ways, in part based on your personal life experience, which I think is probably true for all of us. And then there's just a lot of different directions that you can get at those problems from. And sometimes you feel like you've saturated what you can do from one direction, and you want to try to come at the problem from a different angle.
I love that. And I totally agree. Life kind of led us to some of these pivots naturally without a clear decision. Sahil, looks like you might want to add something.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of chime in. I think one thing you're going to hear throughout the panel is how everybody here is invested in improving healthcare in one facet or another, which I think kind of also just stems from our Georgetown education about men and women for others. But for me, I think my North Star has always been like improving access to high quality, affordable healthcare. And I felt like I had one sort of modality that I really enjoyed working on that goal through on the Hill was through public-private partnerships. So for me, I had gotten that robust experience on the public side on Capitol Hill and wanted to kind of learn how the private side of healthcare works. So for me, it was more about trying to get that other perspective to ultimately help build those public-private partnerships that are going to revolutionize healthcare, as Molly said.
Sahil, great point. I did a brief stint right before I joined this most recent startup at the World Economic Forum, and the public-private partnership is a core part of what they do, and it truly is both. It's not one or the other, so I really, really appreciate that point. All right, let's move on to the second question, unless someone has anything else to add. But what was the most unexpected skill from a previous role that you have proved valuable in your current position? Yes, Bo, go ahead.
Answer that one. So a lot of my work in New York City was about protecting consumers, and it was usually had something to do with a car. Like they bought a car that they were told it was new or like gently used, and then the windshield would be leaking like crazy, and then they would find out, oh, this car was in Hurricane Katrina and nobody disclosed it. So I'm basically helping them unwind the deal and get their money. And so I became an expert on contracts, like what the contract says, what you're entitled to do, what your remedies are. And so a lot of what I do for tests is I have to fight with insurance companies. I have to get things covered. I have to argue with them about why something should be covered. And so a lot of the work that I do is about reading those contracts and bringing sort of that legal perspective and knowing what my rights are. And I feel really passionate about it. I feel like there's a lot of people in rare disease who, if your child is well, you go to the doctor like once or maybe twice a year, for the checkup, and then maybe they have a cold or something. But Tess goes to the doctor like 40 or 50 times during the year, not just primary care, all these specialists. And of course, the more you go to the doctor, the more you're going to access insurance and the more issues you're going to have. So kind of serving Tess, but also all the the people in our group, all the other families who have Howe-Fountain syndrome, which it's now called, I'm really passionate about empowering them and saying, like, what's your contract say? Like, what are you entitled to do? And just helping them sort of fight those battles within the healthcare system, because it can be really exhausting, and it can cost you a lot of money if you don't fight and if you don't know your rights. So that's been really helpful for me.
Yeah. Bo, I have to say, Tess is very lucky to have you as a father, to have such an advocate. So it's really wonderful to watch and hear your story and how you're supporting your daughter. Anybody else want to add to this question? What skill? Yep.
Sure. I can just chime
Molly.
in. Sorry,
Yep.
Molly, I didn't mean to jump in there. But one thing I was just going to say is healthcare is such a highly regulated industry, and all the sort of grounding that I got in policy, regulations, and law through my Georgetown education and healthcare management policy, and then on the Hill, has proved in very helpful as I'm advising clients on the private side as to how to navigate sort of the thicket of all these standards and regulations. And it's always an evolving field. So being able to thread the needle between the two is how I think you can lead to like successful outcomes for change makers in this space.
Great. Molly?
Yeah, I was just going to add, and I mentioned this in my previous answer, but just the advocacy work that you do on behalf of your patient and their families. Obviously, I worked with a lot of different families who had chronic conditions in NICU. They would stay, months, and advocating for them, getting them what they needed while, they were an inpatient, but then also setting them up for success upon discharge. And I think that advocacy skill has just been thread throughout my career. As I mentioned, I was a product manager for a novel device, and really working with the team to ensure that, quite frankly, I would make the most noise so that my product would get what it needed, and to go to market. And I think, but more recently, I would say my advocacy work has really been for nurses and ensuring that they're really involved in the discovery of solutions as well as the design and development, not just the deployment of tech solutions at the bedside, but really being involved in the entire process is so important to quite frankly, to companies, to public health, to patients, and to clinicians.
Yeah, great. And I think I'm going to jump around a little bit because Sahil started answering this question. So what I really want to ask next is how your diverse background, particularly your Georgetown experience and anything you had there, has given you a unique perspective in what you're doing now. And I'll kick off. I think, something that I was sort of unexpected or an experience that was unexpected for me was all the ethics and philosophy classes we took at the time, or just, theology even. I'm not sure if I knew how I was going to apply it when I was at Georgetown, other than it was a requirement. But then I really found that, like, at least in San Francisco in tech, folks really had not pondered some of these things that we really dissected as part of our experience. And I was really grateful to have a firm set of values and really think about, how you think about people or a population, and how you prioritize developing technology, which will be ultimately our future. So that was and I think Sahil also mentioned cure personalis and care the whole person. And I think particularly now in this age, when we're seeing a lot of providers experience burnout, really ensuring that we're not only taking care of and changing healthcare for others, but really taking care of ourselves alongside of it, because we can't take care of others unless we're, fully well and capable, and we're seeing the repercussions of that. So that's just my experience. I'd love to hear how the Georgetown experience or just your diverse experience has shaped your path in your zigzag career.
I can go next. Let's see. I think I have a few answers to that. And again, things have changed and evolved quite a bit since I was at Georgetown. But one of the experiences that I had when I was a senior in SFS and was working on whatever it was called, a senior thesis, was this I was very focused on the international AIDS pandemic. And this was in 2001. So it was before the US government had decided to take a really active, big role. But there was a kind of debate and disagreement between the faculty at Georgetown about whether or not the United States had a responsibility to do something about what was happening in the Africa region in particular. And it was a debate that I did not understand at the time in a lot of ways, just because there was a lot of, or I shouldn't say that. I understood it on some level, but I think it's become clearer and clearer to me as I've gotten distance from it. But it was also a really informative experience, because something that to me seemed very logical, that, we should take some responsibility for saving the lives of millions of people in other parts of the world. There were a lot of other perspectives, which continues to be true. And so I think just the intersection between health and politics, not like partisan politics, but just politics, geopolitics, the reality of the way that systems and institutions work and why things don't get done when maybe they obviously should get done, and how there are different vested interests that influence how decisions are made. I think you don't learn about that in classes as much, but observing the way that that can play out, I think it's so relevant probably to what we have all done since then. And it was not necessarily a positive experience at the time, but it was an eye-opening experience that I've thought about quite a bit since then.
Yeah, that's a great point. I remember taking a class with President DeJoya about like the bottom billion, and how, you can use $1 billion to like actually support resources in Africa and others. So there were so many situations where we were able to explore that. Anybody else? Yes, Bo.
Yeah. First, Martina, let me just say I agree with you so much about ethics and philosophy. I remember like when I was actually at Georgetown and I would be talking to anyone's parents, they would always ask, "What are you going to do with that?" Of course, like anything I want or whatever, I think it is a special thing that sort of informs what we all do going forward. But I think for me, the piece that I use the most from Georgetown has to do with language acquisition and just basic fluency. Like when you're learning another language, if you're immersed in the culture, you move, like I moved to Paris for my junior year and had no choice but to learn French and really learn it, not just understand it, but speak it. And it's a process and it's really frustrating. And when you first do it, you're horrible at it. And this is exactly what I do now with these scientific papers. I mean, I started the foundation with my wife, and I would pull up these papers and it would mention the gene that's mutated in my daughter, and I would have like 50 Wikipedia tabs open at once, just trying to figure out what the paper said, let alone communicate about it intelligently. And over time, just working on it and immersing myself in the world, I finally got to the point where it's like, okay, now I can understand it. And now I need to talk about it. So it's sort of like that next level of fluency. You're really just aiming for fluency. And I'm really happy to say it took a bunch of years. It's taken about 7 years, but now I don't really rely on Wikipedia as much anymore. And I can kind of talk the talk, or at least understand it a little bit better. So it's kind of the same approach.
Great. I love that. And I think the other value that appears to be coming out just from what you've all said is the men and women for others. There is like that strong feeling, other than cure personalities, that there's a pursuit and desire to help others and not just ourselves, which is really powerful. Molly?
No, the only thing I was going to add, aside from what everyone has said, which I wholeheartedly agree with, is really just the exposure Georgetown gave me even early on, just to all the different paths within healthcare and within nursing. We would have someone come in to our class who was a nurse lawyer, someone with a business degree. And, it was just really neat to know that you could create your own path. And I really learned that through some of my courses, but then also through being part of the athletic program, that just because there wasn't a team that, before, doesn't mean we can't carve out our own path, and really being a pioneer.
That's great. I love that addition. Sahil?
Yeah, I was just going to say, obviously agree with everything that's been said. But one of the sort of like technical skills that I found really helpful in my early roles has been systems level thinking. So really identifying like, because healthcare is so interconnected and is a large ecosystem, how changing one aspect of the ecosystem has either downstream or upstream factors or consequences for other parts. And that's something I found that some of my peers don't necessarily have from other institutions. So being able to think through like 360-degree view of how, like, if you intervene with this policy or this, corporate action, how's it going to affect other stakeholders around you?
Oh my gosh, I'm so happy you added that point. I still remember Dr. Goldenberg in our Healthcare in America class had a Rubik's Cube, and I still carry around a Rubik's Cube. And it was, if you impact this, it impacts all different sides. It's not just like you impact health insurance, you impact patients, you impact providers, you impact just everybody around you and all the different parts of the system. So that's such an important point. Okay, next question. How do you explain your nonlinear career path to potential employers or clients in a way that highlights the advantages? So a lot of us appear to have short stints or just like a huge career jump. How do you explain that story backwards? I'll start with myself, Molly, and then I'll go to you. I've had a lot of advising roles or like major jumps, and I always get these calls like, "What are you doing?" And is this like, are you finally going to settle down? And I never do. But like looking backwards, I can piece the story together and it really does make sense in my head. And to me, it's never been something, I've never measured it by time. I think in a lot of the traditional healthcare settings, it's like stay 2 years or stay 5 years and then you can jump. But there have been really significant parts of like why I shifted and the right time, which I'm learning timing in healthcare is really critical, whether it's like a political election and the window of opportunity is open, whether it's a personal experience and it's just not something you can shake off or forget that your daughter, is sick and you realize you have to make the change. So to me, that's been the driving force. And, I've noticed if an employer kind of doesn't understand the story backwards, and my explanation, it's probably not the right place for me. And I have to let go of that too. So I've seen it kind of work out if I'm really following my passions and what I really want to do. In particular, it's been the experience with this latest startup because it's something I wanted to build a year or two ago, was an emotionally intelligent AI, but didn't have the technical capabilities to do so myself, and found this group at the MIT Media Lab. But enough about me. Molly, kick it off.
Yeah, I think for me, it's not so much like obviously you can give someone your resume and walk them through your experience. But for me, it, starts of like why I even got into healthcare, what really motivated me to see an opportunity to make an impact. And then, I never really thought of my career as zigzag, quite frankly, until I, was invited to this. But because it always made sense to me based upon where I was in my life and the opportunity in front of me, and just continuing to learn, quite frankly. So my explanation really has to do with, I worked clinically, and then I moved into an area in medical device that served the market in which I worked. So I could really give them the perspective of the users they were looking for. And then as I focused more on technology, I really just followed kind of where technology was going. Again, really because it was interesting to me, and I had the opportunity and I was willing to kind of pioneer and take the risk. So for me, it's really telling the story, a long story, because I've been at it for 30 years. But I think for me, it definitely it's cohesive and makes sense. And I really wanted to be able to bring that clinical and technical expertise to places where it really needed it. So
Yeah, I love that. I love the continuing to learn. And I think part of that is also the curiosity that we all have that's like insatiable and drives
right.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually the pursuit to like make a significant change and impact in the world. So, I mean, I'm particularly struck by your story since you came from nursing and it's so hard sometimes to make that shift for folks who are so, in one discipline.
Yeah, well, and also just I think too back then it was a nursing major, and you would go work in a hospital or go into academia. The choices were limited. Someone mentioned, they didn't even have public health. I think you mentioned that,
Mhm.
Stephanie. And so there's just so many more opportunities. I was actually very jealous when I went to some college tours for my kids. I was like, I want to be a biomedical engineer.
That's awesome. Anybody else?
What I was going to say is quite similar to what Molly had mentioned, but going back to this idea of a North Star and how like the experiences you've had contribute to that. And then after that, kind of making the case as to what prior experience you've had and the competencies and skills you've gotten and how that would benefit that particular employer in that role or a client if you're taking on like an advisory role.
Great.
I was just going to add that I think, one important piece in here, because when I have like coffees with people who are starting out in their careers, there's sometimes an interpretation of like, it's good to jump around and have a lot of different experiences early on. I think that's, there's a distinction between having like developing deep expertise and experience in one space and then applying it to different spaces and, coming at that problem from a different direction and jumping between very different things without giving yourself a chance to really ever dive in deeply. So I think there is a lot of value of diving in deeply some of these spaces, maybe not all of them, but some of them, and then applying it to other spaces.
I agree with that. Bo, anything else to add before we jump to the other question? Okay, perfect. So now, and I did get a question in the chat, which relates to the last part of our conversation, which is really advice for our students and alumni on how to navigate this. And I'll start off with a question in the chat because it's a little bit more specific than the question I had. But as someone who has moved around between consulting, global health program management, digital health startups, etc., I've always been told my story in terms of a skill set versus deep content area of expertise beyond the top line health, that this is something sometimes made it challenging for my story to resonate with prospective employers who are used to seeing someone with 7 to 10 years in a certain vertical or industry. Have any of you come across this challenge and how do you manage it? How do you tell a compelling, more generalist story? I think this builds on a little bit, Stephanie, of what you said of the like diving in deep. Yes, go ahead.
I mean, I think there's some amount of if people don't really get your story, then maybe it's not the right place to be. I mean, I know that's a luxury to have that philosophy, but I think on some level, it's an asset. I think it's an asset to have, staff and employees who have experience doing different things, and you want to be working in a place where it's seen as an asset. So there's that part of it. You're a hot ticket. Don't forget that. I think, I do think it is not knowing that person's particular experiences, but I do think there is truth to, trying to pick one of the spaces that is compelling and giving yourself some time to really dig in there and invest and, develop expertise, whatever it looks like in that space and rise to a certain level. Because I think you can cut yourself short on opportunities if you move around too much without really digging in. So I think it's a balance. But also, you have a sense of what your skills are and attributes are, and you just got to sell it to the people you want to work with.
Yeah, I think your point about don't selling yourself short. I mean, after all, we're Hoyas, so. But I have also seen, and I think Molly mentioned it earlier, like if there isn't a role or someone that doesn't get it, really crafting your own path. I mean, maybe that's the intersection that like should be pursued and something that is worth driving. I mean, I've seen a lot of people actually build on the experiences they've had, but really like moving around allows you to understand those stakeholders, how they make decisions, what drives them. So I do think it's quite powerful, but oftentimes like there's not that existence of a role, and it's worth pursuing something that you might be starting or might be founding. I think Molly, you were gonna say something.
Oh, no, I think for me, as I look back on my career now, and look at I guess, the last chapter of my career and where I want to spend my time, I go back to, and someone mentioned this, their North Star in terms of um, what are we looking to do and who am I working with? Those are probably two of the most important questions. Um, and in deciding like if it's right for me, if they don't understand my story, honestly, I'm at a point where I'm like, okay, I don't care. But I think it does go back like what's your passion? I never dreamed that I would be at Microsoft when I was at Georgetown. I never dreamed that I would be working on cloud and AI. But I think about kind of the bigger picture of like what are you looking to do and who are you looking to do it with?
I agree. And I think personally, I know there have been points in time where I'm like, what am I doing and where am I going? And I will say connecting with other Hoyas is really powerful. I know I couldn't have, like at Georgetown, I couldn't have planned out the path that I took because it didn't exist. We didn't have AI, we didn't have in healthcare, we didn't have tech to the extent that we have now. So despite the plan that I had, like knowing when to navigate. But I will say, right now I'm staying at the house of a fellow Hoya who's been instrumental. She was part of academic council and a senior when I was a freshman. And just having those folks that you can count on who like see your value and can support you, I think is extremely powerful. And I saw the current dean of the nursing school recently, and the dean of the School of Health. And it's just really powerful and amazing to watch how far Georgetown has come and how like up with the times, really cutting edge and forefront they are in both the offerings that they're providing students, but also just how they connect with alumni. I think it's really shifted since at least I was at the school. Sahil, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to do a shameless plug for the Hoyas and Health LinkedIn page. A lot of great Hoyas there who've had a wide variety of experiences. So maybe that person could peruse through the membership there and find someone who has a similar experience or trajectory and could serve as a mentor for them as they're navigating that inflection point in their career.
Perfect. And before we move on to the last question, I did get one more in the chat, which is someone is curious about the thoughts we might have about the master's programs or law degree programs or any other master's or PhD programs and the value they provided as we've navigated our careers. So it seems like most of us, if not all, have pursued additional tracks afterwards. So I'd be curious how much that's added to your pivots, if it was just like the natural trajectory at the time. Molly?
Yeah, I think for me, just coming from kind of a clinical nursing background and then adding in business, quite frankly, early on in my career working clinically, I felt like hospitals there was a lack of business knowledge among the leaders. They may have been promoted because they were a great clinician. So that's kind of what sparked my interest. And I really wanted to do something that was different. I will say, and I give this advice to I have two boys in college. They're not at Georgetown, but maybe they will be for their masters. But there's so much value in working and going out into the real world and getting that experience and kind of figuring out, well, should I go to law school? Should I go to business school? Should I get a PhD, et cetera? So I would say 100%, I wouldn't be where I am if I didn't have that master's. But I also think that there's tremendous value in working before you make that decision. Like I know some people who went right to law school who are miserable, or they went right to, whatever school, but having that time to kind of reflect on what you've learned and apply it in the real world is super important.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I appreciated, and but we'll go to you next. I appreciated Sahil's point about the systems thinking. I didn't realize how few people actually don't think in terms of systems or that impact of one thing on the other. And understanding what the master's degree, or whether it's a law degree or a master's of nursing or a PhD, how that's going to help shape your thinking, because you might not stay on track of that, but it certainly impacts more broadly, how you're going to apply problem solving and critical thinking to whatever you're working on next. Bo, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say this kind of touches on the earlier question of advice to current students. So I made a massive mistake while I was at Georgetown, which is to believe that networking was something that was kind of cheating, like that, if you didn't get the job on your own sort of merit and just with your resume, then you shouldn't get the job, which was like exactly wrong. And I agree, Molly, that working for any time between undergrad and postgrad is a great move. So I worked at the Justice Department in DC for a year before I went to law school in New York. And so by the time I got to law school, I was like, oh, okay, networking, this is a thing. Like, I really need to do this. And I feel like most grad schools and just post grad stuff, like people at that stage understand a lot more about networking, and they're looking to network with you. It's just much more of a sort of a world in which that's a thing, so much more than an undergrad. And I think if could just go to my 18-year-old self as I prepared to leave the hilltop and just smack myself upside the head and say, like, network, it's important. So because
Although we didn't have all the cool gadgets back then, though. We were in the business card world.
so true. But I like to say, like, I think the beautiful thing about the internet is that you can teach yourself just about anything right now, but you can't necessarily find a mentor,
Yeah.
or an actual teacher, so a person to show you how things are. And I think, if I could tell anybody who's at Georgetown right now, like, take advantage of those people who are there teaching you and go see them and meet them and get to know them and keep in touch with them after you leave. I wish I had done that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think even people of different skill sets, I know, like, I'll just give a plug. The husband of the woman whose house I'm staying at is an investor, and like being able to work together and get that back and forth in collaboration with other Hoyas is also helpful. Some other schools are fine too, but there's nothing like a Hoya. So let's just end this with like any last advice you have for students and alumni who are on this call, who are afraid of making a career pivot because it might look like starting over. Let's just go through everybody and like your best advice that you could give to students and alumni that are hoping to make a change.
You're going to be fine. Don't worry about it.
That's great advice, actually.
Yeah, I was kind of going in the same direction. I mean, don't worry too much about what other people think about. I think it's general life advice, but also specifically in your career, just pursue what you're passionate about and where you feel like you can have an impact and it works for you in your life, and it will be fine. I think where you get in trouble is when you worry too much about what other people think about the choices you're making.
That's great advice. Molly?
Yeah, just along those same lines. I think you have to have, more of that open mindset versus fixed mindset, as was mentioned, just in terms of what's possible. And I would just say go for it.
I love that. Go ahead, Bo.
Yeah, I would say it's never too late to reinvent yourself if you really are following that North Star and what you're passionate about. I mean, I just turned 50, and my wife and I consistently joke about what I'm going to do when I grow up, because I'm not sure when that's happening.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, I've met several folks who come back from maternity leave and are reinventing themselves. And I mean, we all are living a lot longer than usual, and we're all very driven, curious individuals. And like, I love that advice that you could start at any age. We have a few minutes left. I'd love to see if there's any other questions, but I do want to give two special plugs. First of all, I want to thank the panelists. This was amazing, and I learned just as much as probably everybody else on this call. So thank you for joining. I do want to thank the Career Center and Jody, who's on the line, for helping to organize this. And I will continue to plug Hoya Gateway, which I just learned is a resource for alumni, and I'm going to join afterwards. And especially Hoyas for Health. I think just watching how much you guys have grown and the true Hoya passion behind the diversity of talks and where they're located. I mean, there's like Indianapolis, New York, all over the place, DC. And Jody just put in a link for Hoya Gateway for everybody.